can't go through there. That's for authorized personnel only.
I am authorized personnel. I work here.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Turn around and use the public entrance like everyone else.
I'm a judge. I've used this entrance for 6 years. Now please step aside.
Right. And I'm the governor, and I'm telling you to leave.
At 7:45 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday morning, security cameras at a downtown courthouse captured an encounter that would become one of the most devastating pieces of evidence of institutional racism ever recorded. An experienced police officer in charge of building security approached a well-dressed black man carrying a leather briefcase and walking purposefully through the corridors. The man wore an impeccable suit, shiny leather shoes, and had the posture of someone who knew that place well. But to the officer, none of that mattered. All he saw was the color of his skin. What the officer didn't know at that moment would change his life forever. That man was not a regular visitor, not just another lawyer, and definitely not someone who should be questioned about his presence in that hallway. He was Judge Marcus Thompson, newly appointed to that courthouse just 3 weeks earlier. And what happened in the next few minutes, all captured on high-definition video, would be the beginning of the end of that officer's 15-year career. The footage would show not just a moment of blatant discrimination, but would also reveal a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for years. Before we continue, where are you watching this from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. This story gets more and more intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed or been a victim of differential treatment because of your appearance? Type yes or no. We'll need your opinion on what happens at the end of this story. Judge Marcus Thompson was 42 years old and had an impeccable career that had been built brick by brick over 2 decades. A Harvard Law School honors graduate, he spent 12 years as a public prosecutor, earning a reputation for his tireless dedication to justice and his ability to dismantle even the most complex cases. His appointment as a judge was celebrated by the community as an important and historic milestone. Marcus was only the 3rd black judge in that county's history, a fact that should have been a source of institutional pride, but which, as the events of that morning would prove, still bothered some people. Marcus was known throughout the legal community for his sharp intelligence, his unwavering sense of justice, and his ability to maintain order in the courtroom with a rare combination of firmness and respect. Lawyers who appeared before him frequently commented that his decisions were always well-founded, balanced, and impossible to question from a legal standpoint. He had a wife, 2 young children, and took his responsibility as a judge extremely seriously. For Marcus, wearing the black robe wasn't just a job. It was an honor and a calling to make a difference in the lives of the people who appeared in his courtroom. That specific morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual because he had an important hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. The case involved civil rights, a topic Marcus was particularly passionate about, and he wanted extra time to review the documents and ensure every detail was perfect. He parked his car in the employee parking lot, exactly where he had permission and the right to park, grabbed his leather briefcase containing the case files, and entered through the building's side corridor. This was the entrance that provided direct access to the elevators and judges' chambers on the 3rd floor, the quickest route and the one all judges, prosecutors, and high-ranking staff used daily. Marcus had every right to be there. His name was on the nameplate on his chamber door on the 3rd floor. His identification badge was in the inner pocket of his jacket. His credentials were unquestionable. But for Officer Brian Mitchell, who was standing near the elevators that morning, apparently none of that mattered. Mitchell was 38 years old and had been in the courthouse security department for 15 years. He knew practically every judge, prosecutor, and regular lawyer who worked in that building. He greeted many of them by their first name. But when he saw Marcus walking down the corridor that morning, something in his brain triggered an alarm that shouldn't exist. Mitchell blocked Marcus's path with his body, strategically positioning himself between the judge and the elevators. The officer's body language was clear and intimidating, arms crossed, rigid posture, facial expression, making it very clear he wasn't there to welcome anyone. Marcus stopped, maintaining the professional composure he had developed over years of dealing with difficult situations in courtrooms. He knew exactly what was happening, recognized the pattern immediately, but decided to give the officer the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was new. Maybe he simply didn't know him yet. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for this approach. The officer asked Marcus what he was doing in that corridor, using a tone that left no doubt about his assumptions. It wasn't a polite question from an employee fulfilling his duty. It was an interrogation loaded with suspicion. Marcus calmly explained that he worked there and was heading to his chambers on the third floor. He kept his tone, respectful, kept his hands visible, did everything right. But Mitchell wasn't satisfied with that answer. He insisted that entrance was restricted, that Marcus needed to use the public entrance at the front of the building, the one reserved for visitors, for people who didn't belong there. The security camera captured every second of the interaction. The angle was perfect, clearly showing both men's facial expressions, body language, everything. Marcus remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that the camera recorded, a mixture of disappointment and weariness. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him in life, but he had hoped that in a courthouse, a place dedicated to justice, things would be different. He explained again, this time specifically mentioning he was a judge, that he had been recently appointed, and that he used that entrance every day since he started working there. Mitchell reacted in a way that would be described later in investigation reports as completely inappropriate and revealing of deep prejudice. He questioned Marcus's claim, suggesting he was lying about being a judge. He asked for identification, demanded proof, treated Marcus as if he were a suspect trying to invade a federal building. The irony was devastating. Here was a man whose literal function was to preside over the application of law, being treated like a criminal by someone who should protect the justice system. Marcus kept his composure, something witnesses would later describe as remarkable given the situation, and slowly reached for the inner pocket of his jacket to get his identification. What happened next was captured with crystal clarity by the cameras. When Marcus moved his hand toward his pocket, Mitchell immediately moved his hand to the gun in his holster, assuming a defensive posture, as if Marcus represented a physical threat. For a split second, everything could have taken a completely different and tragic turn. Marcus froze instantly, his hands still in the air, recognizing the extreme danger of that moment. He calmly verbalized what he was doing, explaining he was just getting his wallet with the identification the officer had requested. The tension in the corridor was palpable even through the silent security camera recording. At that exact moment, the elevators opened and 3 people stepped out, 2 lawyers and a prosecutor who worked regularly at that courthouse. They immediately recognized Marcus and the strange situation unfolding in the corridor. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Hayes, who had worked with Marcus when he was still a prosecutor, was visibly shocked. She quickly approached, asking if everything was okay, greeting Marcus by name and title, Judge Thompson. The expression on Mitchell's face changed instantly. The realization of what he had just done began to seep into his consciousness, but instead of apologizing immediately, he tried to justify his actions, saying he was just following security protocol. Jennifer Hayes wasn't buying the security protocol excuse. She had known that courthouse for over a decade and knew exactly how security officers treated judges, prosecutors, and regular attorneys. Nobody was stopped in that corridor. Nobody was questioned about their presence, and definitely nobody had a hand placed on a weapon just for walking toward the elevators. She asked Mitchell directly if he had stopped, and questioned Judge Williams that same morning, a white-haired white judge who had passed through that same corridor 15 minutes earlier. Mitchell fell silent, his expression betraying that he knew exactly where that line of questioning was going. Marcus finally managed to show his identification, a leather wallet containing his official judge badge, his driver's license, and his building access card. Mitchell examined the documents with unnecessary scrutiny as if he were still looking for something wrong, some proof that his initial suspicions were correct. The 2 lawyers who had exited the elevator with Jennifer stood watching the entire scene, their expressions showing disbelief and embarrassment at the situation. One of them, a criminal defense attorney named Robert Chen, was already discreetly recording the encounter on his cell phone, having pulled out the phone as soon as he realized what was happening. Marcus retrieved his identification and simply said he needed to go to his chambers to prepare for the morning hearing. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that made clear the conversation was over. He walked past Mitchell and headed toward the elevators, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had just suffered. Jennifer and the 2 lawyers accompanied him, entering the elevator with him. As soon as the doors closed, Jennifer began apologizing profusely on behalf of the courthouse, saying that was unacceptable and that she would personally ensure the incident was reported. Marcus thanked her, but his mind was already working, processing not just what had happened to him, but what that meant for the system as a whole. When Marcus arrived at his chambers on the 3rd floor, He didn't immediately begin reviewing documents for the hearing, as he had planned. Instead, he sat in his leather chair behind the large mahogany desk and simply processed what had just happened. He thought about all the young black men who appeared before him in his courtroom, accused of minor crimes, and how the system often treated them with automatic suspicion before even hearing their stories. He thought about how, even with all his credentials, all his education, all his professional success, he had still been seen first as a threat, and only afterward as a human being. The reality of that moment weighed on him in a way few could truly comprehend. But Marcus Thompson was not the kind of man who let injustices pass without response. He picked up his phone and called the courthouse's chief administrator, a man named David Morrison, who was responsible for the entire building operation, including the security staff. Marcus reported the incident with precise details, using the same factual and objective tone he would use when rendering a judicial decision. He mentioned the initial approach, the questioning without justification, the hand on the weapon, and the obvious contrast with how other courthouse employees were treated. Morrison listened in growing discomfort, knowing this was exactly the kind of problem the courthouse couldn't afford to have, especially not with a newly appointed judge. Marcus then did something few would expect. He formally requested access to all security camera footage from that corridor for the past 3 months. He wanted to see how many times Mitchell had stopped and questioned other people using that entrance, and more importantly, he wanted to document whether there was a pattern in the type of person who was approached versus the type of person who passed without being bothered. Morrison tried to assure Marcus that the incident would be handled internally, that Mitchell would be reprimanded, that it wouldn't happen again. But Marcus made it very clear that wasn't enough. He wasn't interested in vague promises or slaps on the wrist. He wanted a complete, transparent, and documented investigation. News of the incident spread through the courthouse with the speed of a wildfire. By the end of that morning, practically every judge, prosecutor, lawyer, and staff member knew what had happened to Judge Thompson. Jennifer Hayes couldn't keep her mouth shut, and honestly, she shouldn't have had to. She told her colleagues, who told others, and within hours the story was in every corner of the building. The video that Robert Chen had recorded on his cell phone began circulating discreetly among lawyers' message groups, showing the final moments of the confrontation and the embarrassed expression on Mitchell's face when he realized his mistake. What Marcus discovered when reviewing the security footage was even more damning than he had imagined. During 3 months of recordings, Mitchell had approached and questioned 17 different people in that same corridor. Of the 17 people, 16 were black or from other racial minorities. The only white person he had stopped was a young female lawyer who was clearly lost and looking for directions, and even then the interaction lasted less than 30 seconds and the tone was completely different. Mitchell never asked for her identification, never suggested she was using the wrong entrance, simply pointed where she needed to go and wished her a good day. The recordings showed Mitchell allowing dozens of white people, including some who clearly were not courthouse employees, to pass through that corridor without even looking twice in their direction. A white man in delivery clothes passed through the corridor at least 5 times on different days carrying large boxes, and Mitchell waved politely to him each time. But when a well-dressed black lawyer tried to use that same entrance, Mitchell stopped him immediately and escorted him to the public entrance at the front of the building. The disparity was so obvious, so documented, so impossible to deny, that any argument that there was no racial prejudice involved simply crumbled in the face of the evidence. Morrison convened an emergency meeting with the courthouse department heads. The recording of the incident with Marcus was played in the conference room, and the silence that followed was deafening. Some of those present shook their heads in disbelief. Others seemed genuinely shocked, and a few seemed uncomfortable but not surprised, as if they already knew Mitchell had these tendencies. The county's general counsel, who was present at the meeting, made it very clear that this was a legal time bomb waiting to explode. If the story leaked to the press, and it probably would, the courthouse would face a massive public relations scandal and potential lawsuits not just from Marcus, but from all the other people Mitchell had discriminated against over the years. The internal investigation was expanded beyond the specific incident with Marcus. Human resources began combing through Mitchell's history, looking for previous complaints that might have been ignored or minimized. What they found was disturbing. Over his 15 years in the courthouse security department, there were 8 formal complaints filed against Mitchell, all involving differential treatment based on race. 3 of those complaints came from black lawyers who claimed to have been followed by Mitchell through the building as if they were suspects. 2 came from black courthouse visitors who said they had been aggressively interrogated about their presence, even when they were clearly there for legitimate public hearings. Most damning of all was that most of these complaints had been filed away with little or no actual investigation. Mitchell's supervisors simply talked to him. He denied any prejudice, said he was just being careful about security, and the matter was closed. There was no follow-up, no additional training required, no real consequences. The courthouse had essentially allowed a pattern of racial discrimination to continue uninterrupted for over a decade, and now it was coming back to haunt them in a way they could no longer ignore. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was inadvertently exposing a systemic problem that had been swept under the rug for years. Pressure on the courthouse to act decisively increased exponentially when the story finally leaked to local media. An investigative reporter who had contacts within the judicial system received an anonymous tip about the incident and began asking questions. Within 48 hours, the headline was on the front page of the local newspaper and being broadcast on all regional news outlets. The title was devastating and direct: Black Judge Mistaken for Intruder in His Own Courthouse by Security Officer. The article included details about the incident, quotes from witnesses who were present, and mentions of the multiple previous complaints against Mitchell that had been ignored. Public reaction was immediate and furious. Local civil rights organizations organized protests outside the courthouse, carrying signs demanding Mitchell's termination and reforms in the security department. Black lawyers who regularly worked at that courthouse began speaking publicly about their own experiences, with differential treatment, sharing stories they had kept for years, out of fear of retaliation or being seen as problematic. A lawyer named Keisha Williams revealed that Mitchell had followed her to the women's restroom on one occasion, claiming he needed to verify her identification, an experience so humiliating that she almost gave up practicing law in that county. Social media exploded with a hashtag that quickly went viral throughout the region. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences with racial discrimination in professional spaces, and Marcus's story became a symbol of a much larger problem. Local celebrities, politicians, and even some retired black police officers publicly spoke out, supporting Marcus and demanding accountability. The pressure became so intense that the city's mayor was forced to make a public statement, promising a complete investigation and comprehensive reforms in the courthouse security system. Mitchell was placed on paid administrative leave while the formal investigation continued, a decision that angered many people who felt he should have been fired immediately. His union, as expected, defended him publicly, claiming he was just doing his job and that the racism accusations were unfounded. But the video evidence made that defense almost impossible to sustain. Police training experts were brought in to review the footage, and all agreed that Mitchell's behavior demonstrated a clear pattern of implicit and possibly explicit racial bias that should have been identified and corrected years ago through proper training and supervision. During this period, Marcus continued performing his judicial duties with the same professionalism and dedication he had always demonstrated. He presided over hearings, handed down sentences, and treated everyone who appeared before him with the respect and dignity he himself had been denied in that corridor. But those who knew him well could see that the incident had affected him deeply. He became more vocal about racial justice issues in his decisions, more willing to question discriminatory practices in the system, and more determined to use his position to create real and lasting change. The incident didn't break him. It transformed him into an even more fervent advocate for equal justice. The investigation finally concluded after 6 weeks of meticulous analysis of evidence, interviews with dozens of witnesses, and review of years of security footage and complaint records. The final report was devastating for Mitchell and extremely embarrassing for the courthouse. It confirmed that Mitchell had engaged in a consistent and prolonged pattern of racial discrimination throughout his career, that he had violated multiple courthouse policies and basic civil rights, and that his superiors had failed in their responsibility to adequately supervise his behavior and respond appropriately to complaints. The report recommended not only Mitchell's termination, but also disciplinary action against several supervisors who had ignored the red flags over the years. Mitchell was officially fired from the courthouse security department on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 2 months after the incident that destroyed his career. The termination notice cited multiple policy violations, inappropriate conduct, proven racial discrimination, and failure to maintain the professional standards expected of a courthouse security officer. His union tried to appeal the decision, arguing the punishment was disproportionate and that Mitchell was being used as a scapegoat for larger systemic problems. But the evidence was so overwhelming, so clear, and so well documented that even sympathetic union arbitrators couldn't find legal grounds to reverse the termination. Mitchell's 15-year career ended not with a dignified retirement, but with a permanent stain that would follow him for the rest of his life. The courthouse implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond what anyone expected. The entire security department was required to undergo 6 weeks of intensive training on implicit bias, civil rights, and non-discriminatory security practices. 3 supervisors who had repeatedly ignored complaints against Mitchell were demoted from their leadership positions and placed under rigorous performance evaluation. The courthouse hired an outside diversity consultant to review all security policies and procedures, and implemented a new complaint tracking system that made it impossible for discrimination reports to simply be filed away and forgotten. Additional security cameras were installed at all building entry points, with footage being randomly reviewed by an independent oversight team. Marcus never sued the courthouse or sought financial compensation for what happened to him. He made it clear from the beginning that his goal was not personal enrichment, but real systemic change. However, the county recognized the gravity of the violation of his rights and offered a settlement that included a formal public apology from the courthouse, a substantial donation to a civil rights organization of his choice, and a commitment to implement all reforms recommended in the investigation report. Marcus accepted the terms, but insisted that the apology be read in open court session in the presence of all judges, lawyers, and staff, so everyone understood the seriousness of what had occurred. Marcus's story became a case study used in law schools and law enforcement training programs across the country. Professors showed the security footage of the incident to illustrate how racial bias manifests in professional settings, and how institutions fail when they don't take discrimination complaints seriously. Civil rights organizations use the case as an example of why documentation and persistence are crucial when confronting systemic discrimination. Marcus was invited to speak at legal conferences, where he spoke not just about his personal experience, but about the need for broader reforms in the criminal justice system to ensure that everyone, regardless of skin color, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Mitchell disappeared from public life after his termination. He tried to find employment in private security, but his reputation preceded him. Employers searched his name and found dozens of articles about the incident. The investigation report detailing his pattern of discriminatory behavior, and videos of the confrontation that still circulated online. Some reports suggested he moved to another state, trying to start over where his past wasn't as well known. There were rumors he tried to get employment at smaller police departments in rural areas, but even in those places, the digital age made it impossible to escape the documented truth of his actions. He had built a 15-year career and destroyed it all in a moment of prejudice that was captured in the high definition. The corridor where it all happened remains a silent reminder of that day. Courthouse staff still use that entrance. Judges still walk through there toward the elevators, but now there's a different awareness in the air. People are more attentive, more conscious of how they treat others, more willing to speak up when they see something wrong. Marcus continues working as a judge, his reputation not just intact, but strengthened by his courage in not letting injustice pass. He has become a powerful voice for change within the system, respected by colleagues and feared by those who would prefer to maintain the status quo. His experience in that corridor could have made him cynical or bitter, but instead, it transformed him into an even more passionate advocate for equal justice for all.